Escort her out. She doesn't belong in this room. The words cut through the grand auction hall with the cold certainty of a verdict. Conversations faded beneath crystal chandeliers that glimmered above marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Waiters paused mid-step with silver trays balanced carefully in their hands. Collectors turned away from glass displays protecting rare masterpieces gathered from around the world. Every eye settled on the woman standing quietly near the entrance. Naomi Brooks did not react immediately. At 44, she had learned that prejudice often announced itself long before the people carrying it did. She simply stood there in dark jeans, a tailored black blazer, and plain leather shoes. A modest silver watch rested against her wrist. No designer jewelry. No security detail. No assistant hovering nearby. She looked like someone who admired fine art, not someone capable of influencing the market behind it. That assumption moved across the ballroom faster than the guard's voice. The annual Blackstone Heritage Auction had attracted museum directors, elite collectors, celebrities, and investors from across the country. Every detail inside the hall reflected wealth carefully designed to impress. Antique chandeliers glowing above velvet walls, sculptures displayed beneath museum lighting, quiet music drifting through the crowd like another expensive accessory. It was the kind of room where people decided who mattered before introductions were ever made. Naomi approached the registration desk and placed her invitation on the polished counter. Before the receptionist could scan it, Senior Security Officer Daniel Whitmore stepped forward. Tall and broad-shouldered in an immaculate navy suit, Daniel glanced briefly at the invitation before studying Naomi herself with visible skepticism. "Ma'am," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to overhear, "this event is reserved for registered collectors. The public exhibition opens tomorrow." Naomi met his gaze calmly. "I'm aware." Daniel's expression tightened slightly. "Then perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." A few guests nearby exchanged amused smiles. One older collector quietly sipped champagne while watching the scene unfold with open curiosity. Across the room, a wealthy couple looked Naomi over with the easy confidence of people convinced they already understood the situation. The receptionist hesitated, her hand hovering near the scanner. She looked toward Daniel instead of checking the guest list herself. Naomi noticed. Different city. Different room. Same choreography. Suspicion first. Humiliation second. Facts only after the damage was done. Daniel folded his arms. "I'm going to ask you once more to leave peacefully before security escorts you outside." The sentence lingered heavily in the air. Near the center of the ballroom, a young event coordinator glanced up from her tablet, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. Guests were no longer pretending not to stare now. The tension had become impossible to ignore. Yet Naomi remained perfectly still. She did not argue. She did not explain herself. Instead, her eyes moved slowly across the magnificent hall, taking in the paintings, sculptures, and carefully polished faces surrounding her. The silence around her was not uncertainty. It was patience. And before the evening ended, everyone standing beneath those glittering chandeliers would learn how expensive it could become to mistake dignity for weakness. Naomi Brooks neither raised her voice nor reached for her phone. She simply watched Daniel Whitmore with the calm restraint that often unsettled people who expected embarrassment instead of composure. Around them, conversations slowly resumed, though the mood inside the ballroom had shifted. Guests no longer discussed bidding strategies or rare collections. Their attention drifted repeatedly toward the woman standing near the entrance, wondering how long it would take before security finally removed her. Some watched with curiosity, others with quiet satisfaction. Naomi recognized those expressions easily. They had followed her for most of her life, appearing in rooms where people assumed they understood her before she spoke a single word. But tonight felt different. She had not come to prove she belonged. She had come to observe whether this institution deserved the reputation it proudly displayed to investors and clients. 3 months earlier, Aurora Capital Holdings, the global investment firm Naomi founded nearly 20 years before, had quietly acquired a controlling financial interest in Blackstone Heritage Auctions through a series of private investment funds. The transaction had been intentionally discreet. No interviews, no headlines, no public celebration announcing a billionaire investor entering the luxury art market. Naomi preferred first-hand observation over carefully rehearsed presentations. She believed an organization revealed its true culture most clearly when leadership was absent, or when employees believed it was. That was why she arrived alone. Her usual security team remained several blocks away unless she requested them directly. Even members of Blackstone's governing board expected to meet her only after the auction concluded. To everyone inside the ballroom, Naomi Brooks appeared to be nothing more than a guest who had wandered into the wrong room. Daniel glanced again toward the untouched invitation resting on the registration desk. The receptionist still hesitated, her fingers hovering uncertainly near the scanner before pulling away each time Daniel looked in her direction. It was easier to trust confidence than procedure, easier to believe appearances explained everything. Naomi noticed the hesitation immediately. "You still haven't verified the invitation," she said calmly. Daniel gave a restrained smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Experience usually tells me what I need to know." Nearby, a wealthy collector laughed softly before leaning toward his companion. "These events attract all kinds of hopeful people," he murmured without lowering his voice enough. Another guest glanced toward Naomi with polite amusement. "Confidence is free," she whispered. "Buying what's in this room certainly isn't." Naomi heard every word. Her expression remained unchanged. Instead of responding, she slowly surveyed the ballroom again. Rare sculptures stood beneath flawless lighting. Historic paintings rested against velvet walls. Jewelry once owned by European aristocrats shimmered inside glass displays. Every object reflected extraordinary value, yet Naomi found herself far more interested in the people surrounding them. She watched how quickly authority replaced verification, how comfortably strangers accepted assumptions when they arrived dressed in expensive suits and polished manners. Across the room, a young event coordinator quietly reopened her tablet. Something about the confrontation continued to trouble her. She searched the digital registry once more, determined to understand why an invitation no one had properly checked was already being treated as fraudulent. She had no idea that within minutes, a single name on her screen would begin changing the atmosphere inside the auction hall forever. The young event coordinator hesitated above the tablet screen, her pulse quickening for reasons she could not yet explain. Her name was Emily Carter, 26 years old, only months into her first management position, and still idealistic enough to believe procedures mattered more than appearances. After noticing that no one had actually scanned the invitation, she manually entered the registration number into the system. The loading icon spun briefly before a profile appeared. Emily frowned, convinced she had mistyped something. She checked the number again carefully. It matched perfectly. The profile remained unchanged. Naomi Brooks, VIP benefactor, principal investor access, executive clearance level, platinum. Emily blinked once, then looked up toward the woman standing calmly near the entrance. Daniel Whitmore was now speaking quietly with two additional security officers who had arrived beside him, neither aware of what Emily had just discovered. Before she could process it further, auction director Richard Lawson approached with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to resolving expensive problems quickly. Tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed, Richard carried himself with the effortless authority developed through decades inside elite social circles. Daniel leaned toward him and lowered his voice, though nearby guests still caught fragments of the exchange. Questionable invitation, refusing to cooperate, causing a scene. Richard glanced briefly toward Naomi before replying. "Handle it discreetly. We can't afford distractions tonight." Emily stepped forward cautiously, tightening her grip on the tablet. "Mr. Lawson, I think there may be an issue with the registration." Richard accepted the device with visible impatience. His eyes scanned the profile for a moment before narrowing slightly. Unlike Daniel, he immediately understood the significance of executive-level access. But instead of reacting openly, he handed the tablet back. "There's probably been a system error," he said quietly. "Verify it again later." Emily hesitated. "Sir, I already checked the number twice." Richard lowered his voice further. "Emily, tonight is not the time to create confusion over a possible database mismatch." Daniel folded his arms confidently beside them. "Exactly. We deal with situations like this all the time." Emily looked down again at the glowing profile. The executive clearance badge remained visible beside Naomi's name. Her authorization level exceeded that of nearly every registered guest attending the auction. Yet no one except Emily seemed willing to acknowledge what was sitting directly in front of them. Around the ballroom, curiosity continued spreading through the crowd. Some guests pretended not to stare while making little effort to hide their interest. Others watched openly, as though the confrontation itself had become part of the evening's entertainment. Security has become too cautious lately, one collector remarked quietly to his companion. People assume confidence can open any door. Naomi heard the comment, but remained silent. Her attention rested on Richard Lawson now. She studied how quickly he dismissed evidence once it conflicted with his first impression. The behavior interested her less as a personal insult than as a leadership failure. Strong organizations rarely collapsed because of one bad decision. They weakened when people in authority chose convenience over truth. Daniel took another measured step toward her. "Ms. Brooks," he said firmly, "this is your final opportunity to leave voluntarily." Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Have you verified my invitation?" Daniel answered immediately. "I don't believe that will be necessary." Naomi held his eyes for a quiet moment before replying. Professionals usually prefer evidence before conclusions. The sentence lingered between them as Emily stared once more at the profile glowing on her tablet, realizing she was seconds away from deciding whether integrity mattered more than obedience. Emily Carter took a slow breath before stepping away from the registration desk. Every instinct urged her to remain silent. Richard Lawson had already dismissed her concerns once, and Daniel Whitmore clearly believed the situation was resolved. Yet the profile glowing on her tablet refused to disappear. Naomi Brooks, Platinum Executive Clearance, Principal Investor Access. The information was too specific to ignore and far too significant to dismiss casually. Emily swallowed her uncertainty and spoke carefully. "Sir, I really think we should verify this before asking her to leave." Richard stopped walking. His expression remained controlled, though the patience behind it had noticeably thinned. "Emily," he replied quietly, "our responsibility tonight is maintaining order for our guests." "Of course," Emily answered. "That's exactly why we should confirm the invitation instead of assuming there's a problem." Daniel gave a restrained smile, the kind often used by people certain experience had already settled the matter. "You're still new here," he said. "These events tend to attract people who overestimate their access." The remark landed heavily despite its polished tone. Around them, several guests nodded almost automatically, accepting confidence as evidence. A distinguished collector folded his auction catalog and leaned toward his wife. "This is becoming uncomfortable," he murmured. "Someone should handle it before the room turns into a spectacle." His wife glanced briefly toward Naomi. "Exclusive spaces only work when standards are maintained," she replied softly. Nearby, another guest added with a quiet laugh, "People are very good at dressing like success these days." Naomi heard every word without changing expression. What interested her most was not the comments themselves, but how naturally they spread through the room. No one asked questions. No one requested proof. Assumptions moved effortlessly through the ballroom because they arrived wrapped in wealth, confidence, and social familiarity. Emily looked around with growing disbelief. Blackstone Heritage Auctions built its public reputation on integrity, inclusion, and professionalism. Those values appeared in presentations, employee training sessions, and executive speeches. Yet now, when those principles were actually being tested, almost everyone seemed willing to abandon them for convenience. She turned the tablet toward Richard again. "Please," she said quietly, "just look at the clearance level." Richard glanced down for only a moment before handing the device back. "If there's an internal registration issue, we'll resolve it later." "But what if it isn't an error?" Emily asked. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Then senior leadership can address it after tonight's event." Naomi observed the exchange with calm interest. She had seen this pattern before inside companies she later acquired. Employees who still believed in principles, managers more concerned with appearances than accountability, and leadership cultures shaped by comfort instead of discipline. Daniel adjusted his jacket before taking another deliberate step toward her. "I've given you multiple opportunities to cooperate," he said firmly. His voice remained controlled, though impatience had begun slipping through the polished professionalism. "If you refuse to leave voluntarily, security will escort you outside." A noticeable hush settled across the ballroom. Even the musicians near the back of the hall seemed to lower their volume as attention shifted fully toward the confrontation beneath the chandeliers. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Looking once more at Naomi's profile, she noticed an additional notation she had somehow overlooked earlier. Beneath the executive credentials sat a confidential board-level contact authorization reserved for Blackstone's governing directors. Her eyes widened slightly. Whatever role Naomi Brooks truly held, it extended far beyond ordinary investment access. Emily lifted her head toward Richard, her voice steadier now than before. "Sir," she said carefully, "I think we may be handling the wrong person in the worst possible way." Emily's final sentence lingered in the air with surprising weight. "Sir, I think we may be handling the wrong person in the worst possible way." For a brief moment, silence settled around the registration area. Richard Lawson looked at her with visible irritation, not because she might be correct, but because she had challenged his judgment in front of guests. "That's enough, Emily," he said firmly. "Return to your station." Emily hesitated. Every lesson she had learned about professionalism urged her to continue. Every instinct for self-preservation warned her to stop. Slowly, she lowered the tablet, but kept her eyes on Naomi Brooks. There was something deeply unsettling about the woman's composure. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't defensive. She simply waited with the quiet patience of someone who already understood how the evening would end. Daniel Whitmore interpreted that silence differently. To him, it looked like refusal. "We're done here," he announced before nodding toward the two officers standing nearby. They immediately stepped forward. The movement drew the attention of nearly everyone in the ballroom once again. Conversations faded. Champagne glasses paused halfway to smiling lips. Even the musicians in the corner seemed aware that the atmosphere had shifted into something heavier than an ordinary security issue. Naomi watched the officers approach without moving. Years earlier, she might have felt her pulse quicken under the pressure of so many eyes. Years earlier, she might have rushed to explain herself before strangers reached their conclusions. But experience had taught her something invaluable. People committed to misunderstanding rarely changed because of better explanations. They changed only when reality became impossible to ignore. As Daniel closed the remaining distance between them, an old memory surfaced unexpectedly. She was 19 again, standing inside a small art gallery in Chicago. The walls had been filled with paintings she admired but could never afford. Within minutes, an employee had approached her politely and suggested that a community exhibition across the street might feel more comfortable. She still remembered the heat of embarrassment rising behind her eyes as strangers quietly watched her leave. That afternoon had stayed with her for decades. Not because it destroyed her confidence, but because it clarified something painful about the world she intended to enter. Since then, Naomi had spent 25 years building companies powerful enough to buy the kinds of rooms that once questioned her presence. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but because no young woman should ever feel unwelcome simply for walking through the wrong door in the wrong skin. Daniel extended one hand toward her arm with controlled authority. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm asking for your cooperation." Naomi's eyes lowered briefly toward his hand before returning calmly to his face. "I would strongly advise against touching me." Her voice remained even, carrying none of the anger several guests seemed almost eager to witness. Daniel mistook the calmness for hesitation. "If you refuse to leave," he replied, "we'll escort you outside." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some guests appeared relieved that the confrontation was finally ending. Others leaned forward slightly, drawn toward the tension unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Instinctively, she stepped forward again before Richard subtly blocked her path with one quiet movement of his arm. "Stay out of this," he whispered. Naomi slowly reached into the pocket of her blazer. Daniel stiffened immediately, expecting another invitation or perhaps an attempt to argue further. Instead, she removed a slim black phone and unlocked it without urgency. She selected a contact near the top of the screen and placed a brief call. When the line connected almost instantly, she spoke in the same calm voice she had used all evening. "Please notify the executive office that I've arrived." She ended the call before anyone nearby could respond. No dramatic speech followed. No threats. No explanation. Yet something subtle shifted in the atmosphere the moment the phone disappeared back into her pocket. The call lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet something subtle shifted the moment Naomi Brooks lowered her phone. She slipped it back into her blazer pocket with the same composed expression she had worn since entering the auction hall. Around her, several guests exchanged amused glances, interpreting the call as a final attempt to intimidate security. One older collector quietly smirked toward his companion. "Everyone suddenly knows someone important when they're cornered," he murmured. His companion nodded with polite amusement. Truly influential people rarely need to announce it. Naomi heard the remark, but offered no response. She had long ago learned that people determined to underestimate others usually preferred assumptions over evidence. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter noticed something unusual before anyone else did. The registration system on her tablet refreshed automatically. A secure internal notification appeared across the top of the screen, requesting immediate verification of executive-level credentials connected to Naomi Brooks's profile. Emily frowned and opened the alert. Beneath the message sat multiple restricted access indicators she had never encountered before, including direct board-level authorization references tied to Aurora Capital Holdings. Her pulse quickened. Before she could read further, another notification appeared requesting immediate contact with executive relations. Emily glanced up instinctively toward Richard Lawson, but his attention remained fixed entirely on Naomi. Daniel extended his arm toward the entrance once more. "This situation has gone on long enough," he said firmly. "Please walk with us." Naomi met his gaze calmly. "No." The single word carried neither anger nor defiance. Only certainty. Daniel inhaled slowly, visibly losing what little patience remained. "You're forcing this into something unnecessary." Naomi's expression never changed. "No," she replied quietly. "I'm allowing it to reveal itself." Richard frowned slightly. "Reveal what exactly?" Naomi looked around the ballroom, her eyes moving across the polished marble floors, priceless artwork, and elegantly dressed guests observing the confrontation with growing unease. "The culture your institution claims to represent." The sentence landed harder than either man expected. Richard quickly dismissed it with a restrained smile. "With respect, you're not in a position to evaluate this organization." Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the upper balcony overlooking the gallery. Somewhere beyond those private offices, phones had already begun ringing. Executives interrupted conversations. Assistants forwarded urgent messages. Legal teams shifted priorities without fully understanding why. None of it was visible yet inside the ballroom, but the ripple had already started. Emily's tablet vibrated suddenly in her hands. An incoming internal call flashed across the screen. She answered quietly. Emily Carter speaking. The voice on the other end sounded controlled but urgent. "This is executive relations. We need immediate confirmation. Is Ms. Naomi Brooks currently inside Blackstone Heritage Auctions?" Emily looked toward Naomi before answering. "Yes." "Is she currently being escorted to the executive lounge?" Emily hesitated only briefly. "No." A pause followed. Then the voice became noticeably calmer in the way professionals often sounded when a situation had become far more serious than expected. "Remain where you are. Senior leadership has been notified." Emily slowly lowered the tablet, her stomach tightening. At nearly the same moment, several executives positioned throughout the ballroom received messages on their phones. One quietly stepped away from a conversation with international bidders. Another looked toward Richard Lawson with visible confusion after reading a notification. Small reactions, barely noticeable individually. Yet together they formed the first visible signs of something rapidly approaching. Daniel noticed none of it. His attention remained locked on Naomi. "Last warning," he said. "After this, you'll be removed." Naomi studied him for a long moment before speaking softly. "Mr. Whitmore, in a few minutes, you won't be deciding who leaves this building." Daniel Whitmore's faint smile faded the moment hurried footsteps echoed from the upper level of the auction house. At first, most guests paid little attention. The ballroom was already tense, and many assumed additional security had been called to resolve the situation discreetly. But then more footsteps followed. Executives emerged from private offices overlooking the gallery. Department heads abandoned conversations with collectors. Two members of the legal team appeared from opposite corridors, both speaking quietly into phones while scanning the crowded hall below. Richard Lawson frowned immediately. None of this had been scheduled. His own phone vibrated sharply in his pocket. The caller identification displayed only 2 words, Executive Office. Richard answered at once. Richard Lawson speaking. He barely finished introducing himself before the voice on the other end interrupted. Where is Ms. Naomi Brooks? Richard glanced instinctively toward Naomi. She's at the main entrance. Has she been escorted to the executive lounge? Richard hesitated for the first time that evening. No, a long pause followed. When the voice returned, every trace of professional warmth had disappeared. Do not remove her. Do not touch her. Senior leadership is on the way. The line disconnected. Richard stared at the dark screen, feeling uncertainty spread through him with sudden force. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. What's happening? He asked quietly. Richard opened his mouth, but found himself unable to answer. Before either man could recover, the massive doors leading from the executive wing opened once again. 5 senior executives entered together, accompanied by Blackstone's chief legal counsel and the chairman of the governing board. Their expressions were not merely serious. They were alarmed. Conversations throughout the ballroom dissolved into complete silence as the group descended the marble staircase toward the entrance. No one understood why the highest-ranking leaders of Blackstone Heritage Auctions were abandoning influential clients and multi-million-dollar negotiations to approach a woman's security had nearly removed moments earlier. Daniel remained motionless, still assuming the executives had arrived to support his decision. Emily Carter knew instantly that they had not. The chairman reached Naomi first. Without hesitation, he extended both hands toward her. Ms. Brooks, he said respectfully, please accept our sincerest apologies for tonight's treatment. A stunned silence swept through the room. Daniel blinked in disbelief. Richard's face visibly drained of color. The chairman continued carefully. We were informed only moments ago that you had arrived personally. Naomi accepted the handshake with composed restraint. Unfortunately, she replied calmly, your employees noticed my appearance before they verified my invitation. No one moved. The sentence settled across the ballroom with quiet force. The chairman lowered his eyes briefly before responding. There is no excuse for what occurred. Naomi slowly turned toward Daniel and Richard. Neither man could comfortably hold her gaze now. You never verified my credentials, she said evenly. Silence. You never asked why I was here. Still no answer. You decided who belonged in this room before learning anything about the person standing in front of you. Daniel's posture weakened as realization finally replaced certainty. Richard remained perfectly still, understanding too late that every decision made during the past 20 minutes had unfolded in front of the one person capable of evaluating them all. Naomi looked across the magnificent ballroom filled with priceless art, polished executives, and suddenly uncomfortable guests. Then she spoke the sentence that transformed confusion into absolute clarity. 3 months ago, Aurora Capital Holdings completed the acquisition of the controlling ownership interest in Blackstone Heritage Auctions. She paused briefly, allowing the words to settle over the silent room. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aurora Capital. Across the ballroom, expressions froze almost simultaneously as the truth erased every assumption the evening had been built upon. For several long seconds, no one inside the auction hall spoke. The elegant confidence that had filled the ballroom earlier that evening now hung suspended beneath the chandeliers in stunned silence. Every assumption made during the confrontation had collapsed beneath a single revelation. Daniel Whitmore felt the weight of countless eyes shifting toward him. The authority he had carried so confidently only minutes earlier now seemed painfully fragile. Beside him, Richard Lawson stood motionless, replaying every decision he had made since Naomi entered the building. Each one now appeared less like leadership and more like bias disguised as professional judgment. The chairman slowly turned toward the executive team gathered behind him. Suspend tonight's auction, he said calmly. A ripple of disbelief spread across the room. Auction specialists lowered their bidding catalogs. Staff members stepped away from display stations. Digital screens advertising the evening's featured collections faded quietly to standby mode one after another. The most anticipated luxury auction of the season had come to a complete halt before a single item had been sold. The chairman faced Naomi again. Ms. Brooks, the board will fully support whatever actions you believe are necessary. Naomi remained composed, though a trace of exhaustion briefly surfaced in her eyes before disappearing behind her usual restraint. She looked slowly across the ballroom, taking in the priceless paintings, marble floors, and carefully curated atmosphere of exclusivity. Then her attention returned to the people. Employees stood uncertainly near the registration area. Guests avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with how quickly many of them had accepted appearances as proof. Emily Carter still remained quietly beside the registration desk, holding the same tablet no one had wanted to examine closely enough. Naomi finally spoke. Tonight was never really about art. Her voice carried effortlessly through the silent hall. Every organization claims to value integrity, respect, and inclusion. Those words appear in mission statements, executive speeches, and recruitment campaigns. But values are not tested when everything feels comfortable. They are tested the moment someone enters the room who doesn't match expectations. No one interrupted her. I arrived with a valid invitation, she continued. No one verified it. Instead, assumptions became evidence. Daniel lowered his head. The certainty he once wore had vanished completely. Richard glanced briefly toward Emily before realizing the youngest employee in the room had been the only person willing to follow procedure rather than protect appearances. Naomi turned toward her with a small but genuine smile. Thank you for choosing integrity when it would have been easier to stay silent. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Thank you, ma'am, she answered softly. Naomi nodded once before facing the chairman again. Effective immediately, Daniel Whitmore and Richard Lawson are suspended from operational authority pending an independent review of tonight's conduct, including any prior complaints involving client treatment. Neither man argued. The silence around them already confirmed what the investigation would likely uncover. Naomi slowly looked toward the extraordinary collection assembled beneath the gallery lights. As for tonight's exhibition, she said calmly, Aurora Capital will purchase the entire collection at its full estimated value. Audible gasps echoed across the ballroom. Several collectors exchanged stunned looks while executives instinctively recalculated numbers in their heads. But Naomi continued before the reaction could settle. The collection will not remain private, she added. Every piece will be placed on long-term loan to museums, educational institutions, and community art programs, so these works can be seen by people who may never receive invitations into rooms like this. This time, the silence that followed carried something entirely different from embarrassment. It carried reflection. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom, quiet applause finally began to rise. The applause rose slowly at first, uncertain and restrained, before spreading across the ballroom in uneven waves. Yet the atmosphere inside Blackstone Heritage Auctions no longer resembled the polished confidence that had defined the evening earlier. Something heavier lingered beneath the applause now: reflection, discomfort, and the uneasy recognition that dignity had nearly been denied in one of the most prestigious rooms in the country. Naomi Brooks stood quietly for another moment, allowing the silence between reactions to settle naturally. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded respect. She had not humiliated the people who had humiliated her. The truth had accomplished all of that without assistance. The chairman stepped beside her once again. Ms. Brooks, he said sincerely, tonight has forced this organization to confront failures we should have recognized long ago. Naomi offered a restrained nod. Then make certain it becomes more than a public embarrassment, she replied. Institutions rarely fail because of one bad moment. They fail when small compromises become accepted culture. Her words settled deeply across the room. Employees exchanged quiet glances with one another. Some recognized how easily they had ignored procedure once authority sounded confident enough. Others realized they had sensed something was wrong earlier, but chose silence because silence felt safer. Near the registration desk, Emily Carter still held the tablet that had nearly gone ignored beneath louder opinions and stronger titles. Naomi walked toward her across the marble floor, heels echoing softly beneath the chandeliers. When she stopped in front of the young coordinator, Emily straightened instinctively. What's your full name? Naomi asked. Emily Carter, ma'am. Naomi nodded once. Emily, never apologize for asking one more question when something feels wrong. Organizations become stronger because of people willing to protect principles when protecting them becomes inconvenient. Emotion flickered briefly across Emily's face, though she maintained her composure. "I won't forget that," she answered quietly. Naomi extended her hand, and Emily accepted it with visible respect. Around them, several employees watched carefully, understanding the gesture represented more than praise. It was recognition that integrity often belongs to people with the least authority and the greatest courage to use it. Across the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore quietly removed the security badge from his jacket before handing it to a senior executive waiting nearby. Richard Lawson did the same with his identification card. Neither attempted to defend himself. For the first time that evening, both men fully understood that the greatest damage had not been done to Naomi Brooks. It had been done to the values they claimed to represent. Guests slowly began gathering their coats and programs, though the conversations drifting through the hall sounded very different from those heard earlier that night. No one discussed investment strategies now. No one debated record-breaking bids or celebrity collections. Instead, people spoke quietly about assumptions, accountability, and how quickly polished environments could abandon fairness the moment someone appeared unfamiliar. Some guests still looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact entirely. A few remained defensive, even in silence. Naomi noticed all of it. Real change, she knew, rarely arrived in a single dramatic moment. It began only after people were forced to confront truths they would have preferred not to see. At the entrance, Naomi paused briefly before stepping outside into the cool evening air. City lights reflected softly across the windows behind her. Somewhere inside, executives had already begun discussing policy reviews, investigations, and damage control. But Naomi understood something more important. Culture would not change because of speeches or public statements. It would change only if people inside those walls remembered what had happened when assumptions were allowed to replace humanity. She looked back one final time before walking toward the waiting car. "Luxury has never been about wealth," she said softly. "It begins the moment every person entering the room is treated with equal dignity." Then, without another word, Naomi stepped into the car as it disappeared into the city lights, leaving behind an institution forever altered by a woman who never needed to announce her power because her character had revealed it long before her title ever did.